Hello and welcome to Hyperthematics Lecture 2. If you're with me for Lecture 1, we went over sort of a broad introduction to hyperthematics and what it was about in terms of interpretation and where it came from with Royce and Whited. And this time I'll go into a little more detail on several concepts like value and meaning and some practical applications. Classically, philosophers have often started from a position that the real is something out there. Plato thought the real was ideas, and Kant thought the real was things in themselves, which we couldn't get at, which were filtered through some sort of a lens for us, which he called the categories. But most philosophers I started from this position that the real is something that we can't get at, we're separated from, and we have to model ourselves on it so that the things that we do and the things that we think are true or false based on how close they conform to what is out there. In hyperthematics, we don't start in that position. For hyperthematics, value is reality. If you remember what I said about Whited in the last lecture, we assume something like we begin in the flux of reality, and that flux holds value. The solution of the world, then, of this flux of problems of experience, of these different processes, is open to us. And our starting position is that solution as such, solution itself, the interpretation of processes, is what creates reality as value. What is hyperthematics then, and what are hyperthemes, which the name hyperthematics is made up from? Hyperthematics are defined as a creation of metaphysical structures of action harmonization which promote meaningful interpretation and realize value. And a hypertheme is a principle with which we can interpret some region of experience to the opening postulate of hyperthematics, which we'll see in a moment. Hyperthematics is sort of an exercise in what if. Imagine we're playing in a sandbox of experience. Hyperthematics is a series of postulates, suppositions, built upon playing in that sandbox with a first assumption, a first postulate. It's not a proof of anything, it's a suggestion, a series of suggestions. It suggests that meaning and value come first, before the attempt to prove anything. In other words, the attempt to model experience on something real, which is outside of us or beyond us, as Plato and Kant would have added. So in philosophical terms, epistemology, a branch of philosophy, asks, what can we know? And in other words, what can we know about that reality which is out there, beyond us, which we can't really get at, we can only copy. But hyperthematics asks, how can we act in this sort of flux of processes that we're swimming in? The first assumption of hyperthematics is what I call hypertheme H. If you remember what I said about Royce in the last lecture, it's based on Royce's insight. So the first part of H is the world is the community of interpretation of the problem which it presents, or in other words, the world is a hyperthematic structure of interpretation which contains three transformable elements: experience, different experience, and postulated interpretation of the resulting problematic of experience. And you see here my little schematic, as you saw last time: experience, different experience, and interpretation between them. Three transformable elements. In other words, this is what we're assuming to begin with. This is the first fundamental assumption of this philosophy. And the experiences of the world have solutions. That's what's employed in this assumption. That is, they have interpretations which join them. Following on hypertheme H, we have what I call HG, the hypertheme of the goal. And that says, in order to create a community, therefore, since we assume H, in order to create a community of interpretation, select some problem, some goal to solve. In other words, pick two or more diverse, different experiences and interpret between them. And the experiences can be whatever you like. They can be people, they can be people historic, or people current, or people future that you can dream of. They can be parts of nature, or nature modified or interpreted already by humanity, like this rose. It can be objects, physical objects, as we call them, created by people. Historic physical objects. They can be parts of the natural world, geological, or in this case, fossil, like the ancient dinosaurs. And they can be parts of any of these. So in this case, they can be Jackie Robinson as physical, or as a character, or they can be his bat, or they can be some part of this element, the strap, or they can be some bone of this fossil, and so on and so forth. The point is, of HG, pick two of them, select two of them from the flux, and interpret them to one another. This starts off creating a community in some sense. So, some technical terms, not very technical, but I have to use some such terms in the book. So I call these elements. In my little schematic, each of these are elements. Experience, different experience, and interpretation are elements. But so is Jackie Robinson, and so is Jackie Robinson's bat, and so is it as a picture, and so is this phone, and so is this fossil of a dinosaur, and so is each of these bones. Value and meaning. What do I mean by these? Value and meaning. Well, what I call value is an awareness of a process of interpretation as solving some problem between differing experiences. And this awareness can be human, but it can be at a grade which is not human. But I can't say more on that at the moment. So for example, if I give you the numbers, which you know from arithmetic, of 1 to 9, and I say interpret between those. Well, one way to interpret is counting between them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. As I count, I create value, one sort of value in one way. But there can be other kinds of value, of course, besides mathematical. This is a picture of immigrants, I believe, from England to Australia in the early 20th century. So, from moving from England, the experience of England, or London maybe, to Australia, you have two elements, you have two experiences, different experiences. Now the people, the immigrants who made that trip, proceed in the way that they made that trip through an interpretation of those two experiences, and they create value in various ways as they go. Here are some people in mid-20th century building a house. They start with materials, raw materials, board and brick and whatever they might have, and they get to eventually a finished house. Between the materials and what they will build, they're interpreting and they're creating value as awareness of this process which they're carrying out, as solving that problem of material to some structure in some way. So that's value. Meaning, on the other hand, is the awareness of an experience brought about through an interpretation from you or someone or something else. Let's go back to numbers. If I've counted, after I've counted, I have the awareness that I have counted, or I did count. And there I, to some extent, have the numbers laid out before me as I counted. I went through that. I created that value. And if I'm a student and the teacher asks me to do that, I can pass on that meaning to the teacher and I say, I've counted them. In the case of the immigrants between England and Australia, one of them, for example, might have kept a diary, a travel journal of the trip. And so the awareness of the various interpretations which went and joined, which joined those two experiences, the beginning and the end, so-called, is put down in the travel journal and passed on as meaning, either to the future self of the immigrant, if they read over their journal, remember what I said in the last lecture, or to someone else who now reads the journal, someone in the future. And likewise with the building of the house, the construction. The house comes out in the end, and then someone lives in it, and someone has it before them as meaning, which was constructed by other, maybe themselves or maybe other construction workers. And the house gets passed on as something we can walk by, something we can look at. Someone built it. The meaning is, the value, sorry, is held within it as meaning. So those are value and meaning. Another sort of definition, hyperthematic structures, which will be needed to make sense of what I'll say in a moment. Hyperthematic structures are a collection of these hyperthemes. Hypertheme H, which I just explained, and hypertheme HG, and a whole bunch others, which are coming in this philosophy, in the book. These are our dynamic logical principles, which we use implicitly or unconsciously to harmonize our actions to create value and meaning. So processes in the weighted sense, in other words, experiences in action, these, as I called them in the last lecture, somethings which are happening, are put into the mold. They go through, they get run through these principles, aware or not, make up the mold, and they mold these processes, and out they come, hopefully harmonized as more valuable processes. This is what I call a hyperthematic structure, a metaphysical structure of dynamic logic which molds processes of action, different experiences. So, what types do we have? We have hyperthematic structures proper. So, for example, in the book, I talk about games and sports. And games run on H. Everything runs on H. That's the basis of interpretation at all. They run on HG as have a goal, the goal of playing this game, right? Interpreting, in this case, a chess game, this side to the other side. And they run on other principles which are more specific to chess or other games. And our actions go into this mold and come out as the game we played, or the sport we played, right? Music is another kind. We have various processes. We have instruments already made. We have sounds of our voice and so on, and ways of using the instrument. They go in based on H and HG and other principles specific to music, and out comes music as that music, that song, that whatever that we played together. But you also have mixed structures. So one of them, which takes up a good deal of the second part of the book as a test case for this philosophy and method, are corporations. And in this case, you have some hyperthemes which promote harmony and value, and you have some which don't. And so in the case of corporations, sometimes you get better value. You go better in terms of value and harmonizing your processes, and sometimes you don't. It's a mixed bag. And politics is another such structure. You get sometimes more value out of politics, and sometimes you get devaluation. And then finally, you have anti-hyperthematic structures, where processes of action go in and you don't abide by H fundamentally, or you don't abide by this, and you have principles which actually work towards devaluation and loss of meaning. And those actions, those processes, experiences which go in, come out as war, which is on the whole devaluative and meaningless. And you have other things which are overlap with war, other fields of action, so-called, such as torture, which overlaps with war and has its own set of anti-hyperthemes, which produce pain and various kinds of devaluation. So these structures cover a range, in other words, from the ones which create value to the ones which destroy value, with anything and everything in the middle. Another definition, elimination, but viewed dynamically. Elimination is at the heart of this philosophy. If H is the case, then we can say, as I do in the book, H2 prime. Elements which tend toward elimination of elements of their own or other communities of interpretation are inconsistent and unstable elements. So if you remember what I showed you in the last lecture, if we have the assumption of H that we have experience and different experience and an interpretation between them as a third element, but we start removing elements. We remove this element, we have two. We remove this element of interpretation, we're left with one. This tendency of removing, eliminating elements contradicts the opening assumption H, because the opening assumption H assumes this, and now we're saying, no, not this. And we're actively assuming it. We're actively saying, either I shall act so as not to have this, or the world is not like this. And so this tendency, as I say, contradicts the opening assumption H. This is an eliminative tendency, and you can derive it as H2 prime in the negative formulation. Elements which tend to eliminate are unstable. They're contradictory as a tendency with the opening assumption H. And this is what I call dynamic logic. There are more than H2 prime. In the book, page 20, there are H1 prime, H3 prime, and H4 prime, but I won't give those. They're all descriptions of eliminating or constricting interpretation. They're all, in other words, descriptions of ways that our opening assumption H can be contradicted dynamically. And they follow a range. Elimination, in the sense of this method in philosophy, follows a range. You can have elimination in a stronger sense, such as killing. You get rid, in the human case, you try to get rid of the person at the extreme altogether. Annihilation. And at the other end of the range, you have constriction, which is a gentler sort of elimination. For example, imprisoning, so you stop a person's movement, and so on. So it covers this range. So what is the point of hyperthematics? The point is, or the suggestion is, that everything that we experience as good and bad in moral and ethical life is due to these constrictions or expansions of interpretation and experience. But, as I said in the first lecture, good is replaced here by better, and bad is replaced by worse for value, because it's always a tendency. our actions are tending toward being better for value or being worse for value. So let's start with 4 basic hyperthemes besides the first assumption, H, and second, which is derived from it, HG. Let's start with 4 basic hyperthemes, which are the positive correlates of H1 prime to H4 prime. H1 is create hyperthematic structures which do not eliminate elements. Right? Elimination, creating structures which do eliminate elements, is working against our opening assumption as a logical tendency. So do the reverse. Create hyperthematic structures which do not eliminate elements. This is a correlate of H1 prime. In other words, create structures like music. Don't create structures like war. Now, you may say, well, music is very old. I'm well aware of this, and war is very old as well. These structures were created way back in human history. But nonetheless, there are still structures being created and substructures, for example, branches of music and branches of warfare, even as we speak. So, in whatever sense that you're working as a branch of some human activity which is age old, create or build at least that part of the structure so that you don't eliminate elements. That's the principle of H1. The hypertheme H1. H2, which is a correlate of H2 prime, says use interpretive transformations to guide the elements acting in a hyperthematic structure out of eliminating other elements of the structure. So if in your little interpretive community you have elements which tend to eliminate other elements, either in an extreme sense, like I said, or in a constrictive sense, work against that. One way, teach elements, for example, people in your structure, to bring in other elements rather than pushing them out. Teaching is a good example of this. H3, which is a correlate of H3 prime, says create communities of 3 or more elements under hyperthematic structures. If we have a monad, a single experience, this is a very unstable beginning. If we have an experience and a different experience, a dyad, this is still an unstable beginning. If we start with a triad, experience, different experience, and some interpretive element, process of action which interprets between them, this is a relatively stable beginning for a community. And this principle, in a larger sense, is visible in physical experience. And I'll show that in more depth as we go with physics and curvature and the nature of light. But there are structures in the physical world in which this principle is very obvious. And finally, H4 says, create communities which don't eliminate other structures or communities or elements of other structures. And this one's a correlate of H4 prime. So to give you an example of this one, if you consider the branches of science, and science is a more recently built hyperthematic structure than some of the other ones I mentioned, war and music. If you're going to create a new branch of science, don't create a branch, don't create a community to carry that forward, which eliminates other structures or communities or elements. So for example, if elements can be living organisms, for example. If you create a branch of science and you work up a community to work, for example, toward pesticide research, which is destined basically to kill a whole group of living organisms, this is tending to be worse for value. If, on the other end, like in botany, you create a community which is more observing and interpreting between those organisms and between ourselves as humans and those organisms, then this is better for value. So, as in that example, create communities in that manner which tend to expand, interpret, and transform rather than eliminating other structures or other elements or other communities. Next lecture will be on games and some of the hyperthemes that can be drawn out of games. Thanks for watching and see you soon, I hope.